She was 12 years old. She picked up a magazine at school, and she read that her mother was dead. Not recently dead. Dead for a month. Dead by suicide in a locked psychiatric ward in Beacon, New York. Dead and cremated. Dead while Jane Fonda had been going to class, eating breakfast, sleeping, living inside the lie her father had given her. He had told her it was a heart attack. The rest of the country already knew the truth. The article was titled, "Henry Fonda's Tragedy." His tragedy. The governess had known. The household staff had known. The newspapers had run it. Henry Fonda had cancelled every subscription that might have reached his children, married a 22-year-old within months, and moved on. Nobody asked him why he never told his daughter. For 70 years, that question sat untouched. In the court filings, the clinical notes, the press archives. I found it in a footnote. One sentence. No follow-up ever filed. I couldn't understand why no one had pulled it. So I pulled it. What it unlocks does not reflect well on a man who spent his career playing America's conscience. The question was always there. The tragic muse asks it. Subscribe so it never goes unanswered again. Frances Ford Seymour was born in Brockville, Ontario, Canada, on April 4th, 1908. She was the daughter of Eugene Ford Seymour and Sophie Mildred Bauer, a family of solid standing, not spectacular wealth, but enough that Frances moved through her 20s with the ease of someone who had never been required to explain herself to anyone who mattered. By the time she was in her mid-20s, rooms noticed her. Educated, travelled, striking in a way that photographs from the period confirm rather than exaggerate. She moved in circles that her own origins didn't entirely predict. Socialite circles, money circles, the kind that surrounded powerful men and required a woman to be decorative, competent, and strategically invisible all at once. She managed all three. Her first marriage, in 1931, was to George Tuttle Brokaw, a millionaire attorney. His previous wife had been Claire Booth Luce, playwright, congresswoman, future ambassador, one of the most formidable women of the 20th century. Frances was the woman George Brokaw chose after Claire Booth Luce. That is not a minor biographical footnote. That is a measure of who Frances Ford Seymour was in a room. They had a daughter together, Frances de Villiers Pan Brokaw. When Brokaw died in 1935, Frances was 27. She had money, a child, and the rare circumstance that widowhood occasionally produced for women of her class in that era, legal autonomy over her own life. She used it. She met Henry Fonda the following year on the set of Wings of the Morning. They married quickly in 1936. He was 31, already famous, already the embodiment of that specific American quality, the decent, plain-spoken, morally reliable man. That would define his screen presence for the next 4 decades. Audiences trusted Henry Fonda the way they trusted weather forecasts. He seemed constitutionally incapable of deception. That was the impression. Their daughter Jane was born on December 21st, 1937, and was given the full formal name Lady Jane Seymour Fonda, a name that announced lineage before she could hold her own head up. Peter followed in 1940. The family settled into a rented home in Connecticut, and Frances built what the period demanded of a woman in her position: a household, a social architecture, the invisible infrastructure of daily life that made her husband's career possible while remaining entirely uncredited. Henry was away, constantly. Theatre, film. 3 years of active Navy service during the war. When he was home, he was not warm. Jane Fonda described in her memoir, in her interviews, and in the 2018 HBO documentary Jane Fonda, in 5 acts, the particular coldness of her father's presence, the contempt with which he met her emotions, the indifference with which he received her need. His New York Times obituary praised the characters he played as men of honesty and decency. That detail is precisely the measure of the distance between the man on screen and the father in the house. Frances was struggling through all of it. What Jane would eventually identify, after obtaining her mother's medical records while writing her 2005 memoir, was bipolar disorder. In the 1940s, that diagnosis didn't exist. What existed instead were women who felt too much, described in clinical notes as nervous or highly strung, and the institutional response: remove them from the household until they could be managed into something quieter. Frances was hospitalized more than once during the marriage. Each time she came back. Each time Jane and Peter were told some version of nothing. Jane Fonda told The Guardian what a child builds from that silence. When a parent vanishes without explanation and returns without one, the child doesn't conclude that the parent is ill. The child concludes she is the reason. She is not enough. She is not lovable. Jane was constructing that belief throughout her childhood, in real time, on false information. Then Henry Fonda told Frances he wanted a divorce. This was 1949. He had been involved with Susan Blanchard, 22 years old, for some time. He wanted to marry her. He delivered this to his wife while her mental health was already fragile, while she had already cycled through psychiatric care, while their daughter was 11 and their son was 9. The deterioration was rapid. In January 1950, Frances was admitted to a psychiatric hospital. She threw her wedding ring out the window and then jumped after it. The first attempt. She survived. She was transferred to Craig House Sanitarium in Beacon, New York, a high-security facility. In April, she was permitted a supervised visit home. Nurses accompanied her. Jane was there, 12 years old, and angry in the unfocused way children are angry when they lack the vocabulary for what is collapsing around them, and she refused to engage with her mother that day. They did not speak. It was the last time they were in the same room. Frances returned to Craig House. During the visit, she had slipped a small china box from the bathroom into her belongings. A few weeks later, she took a razor from it. She left a note on the bathroom door asking that no one enter. On April 14th, 1950, Frances Ford Seymour was found dead. She was 42 years old. Nobody told Jane Fonda what happened next. Nobody said anything. Nobody asked. And she had no reason yet to ask herself. Henry Fonda told his children their mother had died of a heart attack. It was a deliberate lie, quickly constructed and carefully maintained. Within days of Frances's death, the newspaper subscriptions to the Fonda household were cancelled. The magazine subscriptions too. The article already telling the country the truth was removed from the path between his children and it. Not by accident, by design. The governess knew. She said nothing. The household staff knew. They said nothing. Henry Fonda had organized a managed silence around 2 grieving children, and everyone inside that house held it. The question was obvious. That was the problem. Because asking why he lied requires confronting what the truth actually was. And the truth was this. Henry Fonda had spent years absent from a marriage to a mentally ill woman, had been openly unfaithful throughout, had told his wife he was leaving her for a woman 23 years younger while she was already institutionalized, had filed for divorce as she deteriorated, and had married Susan Blanchard within months of Frances's death. Blanchard was 9 years older than Jane. That is not the biography of a man of honesty and decency. It is the biography of a man for whom the screen persona was extraordinarily convenient. The entertainment press covered him extensively through this period. They processed Frances's death as his grief, his name in the headline, his emotion in the frame. Frances became a subordinate clause in a story about Henry, his tragedy, his loss, his burden to bear with quiet dignity. No reporter asked what his children had been told. No columnist raised it in the 32 years of profiles and interviews that followed. No biographer pursued the gap. Nobody asked why. What sustained the silence was not a conspiracy with participants and meetings. It was a structure. The structure that made powerful men's private conduct legible as private matters, and women's suffering legible as domestic tragedy, and children's experience of both legible as nothing requiring examination. That structure needed no coordination. It ran on assumption. Inside the Fonda household, Frances was further erased. Her photographs largely disappeared after April 1950. Her name was not spoken. Henry married Susan Blanchard, and the household moved forward. New wife, new arrangement, new surface presented to the world. The divorce proceedings, the estate settlement, Frances's clinical history, the documented record of what had driven her to Craig House in the first place. All of it was filed and left sealed. Consider what Frances's last year looked like from inside it. Her husband had filed for divorce. She had no career of her own. The decades she had spent building his household, managing his social life, raising his children, had not produced an independent income or an independent identity. The courts would settle her estate. The sanitarium would process her death. The press would name the event after her husband. She had no institutional advocate anywhere in that sequence. The only people with the standing to ask questions about her children's welfare were her children's father, who was the cause of the crisis, and the governess, who had been hired by him and remained loyal to him. The question of what Jane and Peter knew was never raised by anyone with the standing to raise it. That is not an accident. That is what happens when a woman's story moves entirely through administrative systems controlled by the man who ended her marriage while she was locked inside a psychiatric facility. Here is the reason the press never asked. The institutions most likely to pursue it, journalists, biographers, court officers, had all categorized the story before they filed a single question. Once the category was fixed, Henry Fonda's tragedy, private grief, a great man's burden, everything that might have unsettled it simply wasn't generated. The children were not the story. They were scenery. And scenery does not require follow-up questions. That category held for 7 decades. What makes this worth examining now is not that it was exceptional. It was the standard operation of power and gender and institutional indifference in mid-century America, running exactly as designed. What makes it worth examining is the specific cost to a specific 12-year-old girl who had to read in a magazine what her father could have told her in a room. Ask the question that nobody asked, and the first answer arrives quickly. Henry Fonda chose not to tell his daughter. He built a managed information environment to prevent her from finding out. When that environment failed, when Jane encountered the magazine at school, he still did not have the conversation. The governess had it. Henry Fonda never discussed Frances's death with Jane directly. Not that month. Not that year. Not in the 32 years he lived after April 1950. That answer is damaging on its own. But the damage it points to runs deeper than one withheld conversation. If the silence was maintained with that much deliberate effort, then the real question is not what Jane was told. It is what Jane was living inside, in real time, during the years the silence held. Not only the month after Frances died, all of it. The hospitalizations nobody explained. The mother who vanished and returned and vanished again. The household reorganizing itself around a divorce nobody narrated to the children. The final home visit when Jane was angry and they did not speak. And then the magazine at school. And then the governess confirming it. And then nothing. The household moved forward. Henry Fonda married Susan Blanchard. Frances's name was retired. She was 12 years old and had just been handed the truth and no permission to use it. She filled the absence with herself as the explanation. She was not lovable enough to make her mother stay. She was not enough of anything to make her father present. Her body, already the subject of her father's corrections through intermediaries, was the problem requiring repair. That belief accumulated over years, in a household that never once provided the factual correction that would have dismantled it. Now a harder question opens underneath that one. Henry Fonda gave hundreds of interviews between 1950 and his death in 1982. He was profiled in every major American publication. His marriages were covered, all 5 of them. His relationship with Jane, which was famously strained and publicly documented across decades, was covered extensively. Not once, in any of those profiles, did a journalist ask him directly, "Did you tell your children what actually happened to their mother?" The question was available. It appeared in no transcript. That absence is its own answer. To who, in 1950 and in the decades that followed, was considered to have a story that required an accounting? And the third answer follows immediately from the second. When Jane found out, from the magazine, confirmed by the governess, the household did not adjust. There was no acknowledgement, no correction, no space opened for grief to exist in its true form. She had the truth now. She was required to continue living inside a household that treated the truth as though it did not exist. She could not raise it. She could not build a question around it. She was 12 years old and had just been conscripted into the same silence that had been organized around her, not because anyone explicitly asked, but because the structure of that household made any other behavior impossible. That is a particular species of damage, not the original lie. The enforced participation in its continuation. And underneath all 3 answers, the shape of the full picture is now visible. It does not look like a series of individual failures. It looks like a system that was working exactly as designed, and that would continue working for decades at her expense. Ask the question, why didn't Henry Fonda tell his daughter her mother was dead? And a door opens immediately. The lie required infrastructure. It required the governess's silence, the cancelled subscriptions, the agreement, active or passive, of every person in that household that the 12-year-old girl and the 10-year-old boy would not be given the truth. That infrastructure was assembled in the days after April 14th. Quickly, because the press was already running the story and the window for controlling the children's access to it was narrow. Henry Fonda organized it. He was the one person in that household with the authority to build a managed silence and expect it to hold. Why did no one examine that infrastructure at the time? Because the press had already made its editorial assignment before anyone asked a question. His grief was the story. To ask about what his children knew would have required treating them as independent subjects, people with their own experience of the same event, rather than as background detail in his narrative. That reassignment never occurred to anyone who covered him. The first door opens onto this. The lie was not a private impulse of a grieving man trying to shield his children from pain. It was a managed information environment, built fast and sustained for years, whose purpose was the preservation of his public identity. The children's welfare was incidental to that purpose. Their grief was not the thing being protected. That door had been locked since the first time Frances was institutionalized, and her children were given silence in place of an explanation. The first answer raises a second question. What did living inside that constructed silence actually produce in Jane Fonda? The record here is precise because Jane built it herself. Across 40 years of interviews, in her memoir, in the HBO documentary, in public testimony she gave from her 30s until well into her 70s. Her father sent a stepmother to tell her she needed to lose weight, to wear longer skirts, that she had things to correct physically if she wanted to be loved. He had, by her own accounting, an obsession with female thinness, and 3 of his 5 wives developed eating disorders. I was taught by my father that how I looked was all that mattered, she told Harper's Bazaar. Unless you look perfect, you're not going to be loved. Bulimia began at Emma Willard boarding school in Troy, New York, the same years she was living inside the lie about her mother's death, with no permission to address it. At the disorder's worst, decades into adulthood, she was purging up to 20 times a day. It lasted 30 years. The second door opens onto a pattern that neither the lie nor the eating disorder reveals alone. They are both symptoms of the same condition. A household in which Jane Fonda's interior life, her grief, her fear, her need for honest information about her own circumstances, was consistently subordinated to her father's preferences. His preference for a clean story. His preference for a composed, thin, uncomplaining daughter. His preference for silence over any explanation that might complicate his own account. The lie about Frances's death was not the origin of what happened to Jane. It was confirmation that the origin had been operating her entire life. Hold both previous answers together, and a third question surfaces. What did Jane Fonda actually know about her mother? And what, specifically, had been kept from her? She knew Frances had died. She knew the cause was suicide. She knew it had happened inside a locked facility. What she did not know, for more than 50 years, was why her mother had been the kind of woman who ended up inside one, what had made her that way, what the true beginning of the story was. When Jane obtained Frances's medical records while writing her memoir in the early 2000s, she was in her 60s. She had expected clinical bureaucracy, diagnoses, medication records, the paper management of a woman deemed difficult. What she found instead was the first chapter. Frances had been sexually abused as a child. She was 8 years old when it happened. It was in the records. It had always been in the records. In 50 years of Frances's story being discussed, in press coverage, in divorce proceedings, in psychiatric files, no one had suggested her daughter look. "The minute I read that," Jane said at the Rape Treatment Center in 2014, "everything fell into place. I knew why the promiscuity, the endless plastic surgery, the guilt, the inability to love or be intimate, and I was able to forgive her, and forgive myself." The third door opens onto this. Frances Seymour was not inexplicably ill. She was a woman carrying unprocessed childhood trauma through 4 decades of an era that had no language for it, no adequate treatment for it, and no institutional inclination to find it in the histories of women who were proving inconvenient. Her suffering had a human cause. The cause was documented. The documentation was accessible to anyone who looked. Her daughter looked, in her 60s, alone. When all 3 answers are held simultaneously, the thing that was always underneath them becomes visible. Henry Fonda's lie to his children on April 14, 1950, was not a discreet act of cowardice or grief or misguided protection. It was the final move in a sequence that had been running for years. The absence, the infidelity, the divorce filing served to a mentally ill wife, the remarriage within months, the sealed household, the retirement of Frances's name. Each move in that sequence served the same purpose. Every element pointed in the same direction. The protection of the image. The man who embodied American moral authority on screen for 4 decades had left a mentally ill woman for a younger one, accelerated her deterioration, and then managed the aftermath, including what his own children were allowed to know, as a reputation problem. The lie to Jane and Peter was the final administration of that management. Plain, documented, sitting in the record for decades alongside everything it required to be understood. The question had been there the entire time. Everything it unlocked had been there with it. Jane Fonda began asking the question long before she had the words for it. She began, as people do, by talking around the edges of something she couldn't yet approach directly. The first time she asked. In the 1970s and into the 1980s, Jane Fonda entered sustained therapy. By then, she was famous across multiple registers. Academy Award winner, political activist, fitness entrepreneur. And she was also, by her own account, unhappy in a way she could not precisely locate. The success was real. The unhappiness was real alongside it, running parallel, never explained by the success and never resolved by it. In therapy, she began tracing what her childhood had built in her. She talked about her father, the weight comments delivered through a stepmother rather than spoken directly, as though even his contempt required a buffer, required him to remain at a distance from the damage he was causing, the coldness that met every attempt at connection, the contempt for ordinary need, the way he had arranged his own grief around his own experience of Frances's death and left his children to arrange theirs alone, in the dark, without the true information that grief requires. What the first asking cost her was the only story she had, the story in which she was the explanation for everything that had gone wrong. Her unlovability had driven her mother to illness. Her inadequacy had made her father cold. Her body, already the subject of her father's corrections before she was 15, was the thing requiring repair. That story was painful, but it was hers. She had lived inside it long enough that dismantling it felt like losing something, not gaining something. Therapy asked her to put it down. She put it down. What she had after paying that price was the beginning of an accurate account, but only the beginning, the outline of where Frances should have been. A shaped absence, something clearly missing from a story that had been handed to her with that absence already built in. The question she was asking could not yet be completed. She didn't have enough of the truth. The second time she asked. In 1981, Jane Fonda bought the rights to On Golden Pond, a play about a daughter and a cold, remote father attempting repair across one summer, and produced it specifically to perform it alongside Henry Fonda. She has said plainly that the film was a surrogate for the conversation their real relationship had never once permitted. Henry Fonda won the Academy Award for Best Actor for that performance. He was too ill to attend the ceremony. Jane accepted it on his behalf. He died 5 months later, in August 1982. She got the film. She did not get the conversation. When Henry Fonda died, everything between them that was unresolved became unresolvable. The accounting she had been trying to bring to him, about Frances, about the lie, about what those years of silence had cost her, would never receive a response. Not from him, not from anyone who had been inside the house when the silence was organized. That door closed in August 1982 and did not reopen. She had less after paying that price, permanently less, and she kept going. The third time she asked. In the early 2000s, Jane Fonda began writing My Life So Far. She dedicated the memoir to Frances. She has said she chose the dedication deliberately, knowing it would make the work unavoidable. That writing her mother's name on the first page would require her to actually find out who her mother was, rather than continuing to carry the outline. She requested Frances's medical records. She was in her 60s. She had expected the bureaucratic record of a woman being institutionally managed, diagnoses, medications, clinical assessments in the flat language of mid-century psychiatry. What she found instead was the first chapter of a story she had never been given. Frances had been sexually abused when she was 8 years old. It was documented. It had been in those files for 50 years. In all the decades of Frances's story being processed, in the press, in the divorce filings, in the psychiatric notes, in the estate records, no one had looked, and no one had told Jane there was something worth looking for. She stopped when she read it. Everything she had never been able to understand about her mother. The compulsive surgeries, the inability to be intimate, the guilt that appeared sourceless, the hospitalizations that seemed to have no trigger, rearranged into a picture that was suddenly, devastatingly coherent. What that asking cost was time, 50 years of it. The grief she might have processed in her 20s with the complete account. The forgiveness that became available the moment she read those records and might have been available 30 years earlier. The relationship with her mother's actual story, not the absence, not the footnote, that she might have carried across her adult life instead of only at its far end. The weight arrived all at once. She paid for asking. She kept going anyway. The last time she asked. In 2014, Jane Fonda stood at the Rape Treatment Center and spoke publicly about what she had found in her mother's records. She was 76 years old. She spoke about childhood sexual abuse and what it does when it travels undisclosed and untreated through generations. How it moves forward as an inheritance. Nobody claimed and nobody warned the daughters about. By then, she had paid everything. The 30 years of an eating disorder built on her father's contempt for her body. The marriages she could not be fully present inside. The father she had built a film around in the hope of reaching him, and hadn't. The memoir, the documentary, the decades of testimony. She stood at that podium and said, "I wish my mother could have told and been believed." She asked 4 times. Each time it took something that did not come back. By the 4th time, she was paying with what little remained. And she asked anyway. Nobody asked Henry Fonda why his 12-year-old daughter had to find out her mother was dead from a magazine. Here is the full price of that omission. It stripped Jane Fonda of the truth about her own grief. Not only the method, suicide rather than heart attack, but the entire architecture of understanding that accurate information makes possible. When a parent dies by suicide, the grief has specific demands, specific questions, specific work, a reckoning that requires knowing what actually happened and why and who was in the room when the conditions for it were set. Jane was given a neutral, causeless death, a heart attack, clean and blameless, and left to mourn something that hadn't occurred. The real grief had nowhere to go. It went somewhere anyway. Inward, unnamed, chronic. It denied her the context for her own suffering, the bulimia that began at 12 and lasted 30 years, the relationships she moved through without being fully present inside them. The persistent conviction, sourceless, she thought, but not sourceless, that she was fundamentally unlovable, a conclusion she had drawn from her childhood and continued drawing from it because the information that would have corrected it was never provided. She knew the weight was real. She could feel where it came from. She couldn't put it down because she didn't have its true name. The name was in a file she didn't know to request, and it cost her Frances, the actual woman. Frances Ford Seymour was not a footnote. She was a woman who survived childhood sexual abuse and constructed a life from the wreckage of it. Married twice, raised 3 children across a war, maintained a household through years of her husband's absence and infidelity, held herself together through hospitalizations that had no dignified explanation and no adequate treatment, and died at 42 in a locked room 3.5 months after the man she had organized her adult life around told her he was leaving for someone younger. That is a complete life. It deserved a complete account. What it received was a headline with someone else's name in it. What Henry Fonda's management of her death ensured was that Frances's own children grew up with a mother assembled from silence and inference. A partial figure, inexplicably ill, inexplicably gone, reduced to the precipitating event in someone else's story. Jane spent the first two-thirds of her adult life unable to fully forgive a woman she had never been permitted to fully know. She spent her 60s reconstructing who Frances actually was from documents she had to request herself. Without guidance, 50 years after the trail was laid down, the silence did not have one casualty. Peter Fonda was 10 years old when his mother died. He had 2 fewer years than Jane, 2 fewer years of development, 2 fewer years of the reasoning that might have helped him locate the loss outside himself. Jane has said publicly that Peter was profoundly affected by the suicide and by the household's refusal to acknowledge it. When he was 10, shortly after Frances's death, he accidentally shot himself in the stomach, a wound serious enough to mark his biography for the rest of his life. The silence moved through that household with equal weight in both directions. Henry Fonda's decision, heart attack, subscriptions cancelled, name retired, was not a contained, private act of a grieving father. It was a decision that shaped two children's lives, across decades. Frances's full story, the abuse, the illness it generated, the marriage it made her vulnerable to, the death it eventually produced, was available the entire time. The court filings, the clinical notes at Craig House, the press archives, the medical records. Nothing had been destroyed. What was absent was the single question that would have assembled the components into a coherent account. Without it, the pieces sat in separate files for 50 years and added up to nothing. Jane Fonda assembled them herself, without assistance, from materials that had always been there. Nobody asked Henry Fonda why his 12-year-old daughter had to find out her mother was dead from a magazine. What that silence protected was his image. What it cost was 2 childhoods and 2 adult lives shaped around a grief that was never given its true name, and one woman's complete erasure from her own story. Before the question was asked, the available account said this: Frances Ford Seymour had mental illness and died tragically young. Henry Fonda was a grieving widower who remarried and moved forward with quiet dignity. Life magazine described him in 1948 as a man whose decency on screen was simply an extension of who he was, an actor who didn't act so much as reveal his own character. His children had been protected, the narrative held, from a truth they were too young to bear. Jane Fonda had survived a difficult childhood and built something extraordinary from it. 2 Academy Awards, a political life, a cultural footprint that spanned 5 decades. Her mother was a chapter in that origin story. Brief, sad, resolved. Anyone reading the record through that frame would have concluded, hard beginning, admirable outcome, the past appropriately behind her. The tragedy was part of what produced her. It had served its narrative purpose. That was the account that stood for 7 decades. After the question was asked and followed, through the medical files, the memoir, the therapy records, the 4 decades of public testimony Jane Fonda gave about what her childhood had cost her, the record shows something entirely different. Frances Ford Seymour was a woman whose entire life was shaped by an abuse committed against her when she was 8 years old, documented in a file that sat unopened for 50 years. Her illness was the consequence of that abuse, not a random affliction, not an unexplained fragility, but the predictable result of childhood trauma moving through a life that had no language for it and no treatment adequate to it. Her marriage was to a man who was absent and unfaithful throughout, who told her he was leaving while she was already institutionalized, who filed for divorce as she deteriorated, who married another woman within months of her death and ensured that her name was not spoken in his house again. Her children were handed a lie about how she died, and then handed nothing further. No grief, no explanation, no permission to form a question about any of it. Henry Fonda, who spent 40 years embodying American moral authority on screen, organized an information environment to prevent his daughter from knowing her mother was dead. He maintained it until a magazine broke through it. He never corrected it after that. He died in 1982, without ever having the conversation. Jane Fonda did not overcome a difficult start and move on. She spent her adult life reconstructing a story that had been deliberately withheld from her, paying for each recovered piece with something that did not come back, until she finally held the complete picture in her 60s, standing at a podium and saying out loud what should have been said to her at 12 years old by her father in a room on an ordinary afternoon. That gap is not interpretation. It is not revisionism. It is the distance between the managed account and the documented one. And the distance is the precise measure of what the silence extracted. Frances paid for it with her erasure from her own story. The woman who had been chosen after Claire Booth Luce, who had raised 3 children through a war, who had survived what she had survived, reduced to a subordinate clause in a headline about her husband. Jane paid for it with 50 years of incomplete grief, 30 years of an eating disorder, and a lifetime of trying to know a woman she had never been given permission to fully find. Both payments were extracted by one decision, made by one man, for one purpose. He was not willing to have the truth of his second marriage become part of his public record. It worked for 7 decades. Why didn't Henry Fonda tell his daughter her mother was dead? Because the truth about Frances required the truth about him, and he was not willing to pay that price, so his children paid it instead.